The cry beneath the ice. The creek screamed beneath inches of black ice, but Ethan Cole heard something else, something impossible. A voice, small, fragile. One word carried on the merciless wind. Mama. He saw her then, a bundle of cloth and flesh being dragged toward the frozen rapids, her tiny fingers clawing at nothing. No time to think, no time to plan. The cowboy plunged into water so cold it stole his breath, his lungs burning as the current tried to claim them both. He pulled her free just as the ice cracked like rifle fire behind them. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. The Montana Territory didn't forgive mistakes. Ethan Cole had learned that truth the hard way, carved it into his bones over 15 winters working cattle and timber in country that killed the unprepared. He'd built his life around solitude, a solid cabin tucked against the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, a small herd of horses, and enough supplies to outlast any storm the mountains could throw at him. He preferred it that way. Alone meant safe. Alone meant nobody got hurt because of his failures. But that December afternoon, alone became impossible. Ethan had been checking his trapline, the kind of routine work that kept a man fed through the brutal months. The forest stood silent under heavy snow, every branch weighted down, every sound muffled except for the constant rush of Blacktail Creek cutting through the frozen landscape. The water ran too fast to freeze completely, creating a deadly channel of black water beneath deceptive ice along the banks. He was nearly back to the cabin when he heard it. At first he thought it was wind. The mountains played tricks with sound, threw voices across valleys that weren't there. But this was different, rhythmic, desperate. He stopped, one hand on the rifle slung across his shoulder, listening. There it was again. Crying. Not an animal. A baby. Ethan's heart kicked hard against his ribs. There shouldn't be anyone out here. The nearest settlement was 12 miles south, and nobody traveled these trails in deep winter. Nobody sane, anyway. The crying grew louder, more frantic, carried on gusts of wind that cut through his wool coat like it was paper. He moved toward the sound, boots crunching through knee-deep drifts, following the terrible logic of that small voice toward the creek. That's when he saw her, a bundle of dark cloth tumbling along the icy bank, caught in the current's pull where the water ran exposed. The baby, she couldn't have been more than a year old, was half submerged. Her tiny body dragged inexorably toward the rapids downstream where the creek dropped 15 feet over jagged rocks. Mama! The word came out weak, almost lost in the roar of water. Ethan didn't think. Thinking got people killed. He ran, each step a battle against snow and slope, shrugging off his rifle and coat as he reached the bank. The ice extended 3 feet from shore, deceptively solid-looking, hiding the lethal current beneath. He tested it with one boot. It held. Barely. The baby slipped further into the water, her cloth wrappings soaked, weighing her down. Maybe 5 seconds before the current took her completely. Maybe less. Ethan stepped onto the ice. It groaned beneath his weight, but held. 2 more careful steps, arms extended for balance, eyes locked on that small, struggling form. The cold rising from the water below made his bones ache even through his boots. 3 steps. 4. The ice cracked. Not a clean break. A spiderweb of fractures spreading from his right foot, the sound like distant thunder. Ethan dropped to his hands and knees, distributing his weight, the frigid surface biting through his gloves. The baby was just beyond his reach now, her fingers grasping at nothing as the current pulled. Hold on, he said, knowing she couldn't understand, knowing it didn't matter. Just hold on. He stretched forward, every muscle locked tight, and his fingertips brushed soaked cloth. Not enough. The ice complained again, more cracks radiating outward. If he went through here, they'd both die. The current would drag them under the ice downstream, trap them in a frozen coffin. Ethan pushed forward another 6 inches, felt the ice sag beneath him, and grabbed. His fist closed around fabric and small limbs. He pulled, dragging the baby toward him as the ice gave way completely. The shock of the water hit him like a physical blow, so cold it stopped being cold and became pure pain, every nerve ending screaming. The current grabbed at his legs, tried to sweep him sideways toward the rapids. He locked his free arm over solid ice and held on. The baby was in his grasp now, pulled tight against his chest. She wasn't crying anymore, wasn't moving. That terrified him more than the water trying to kill them both. Ethan kicked hard, using the current's sideways pull to help swing them toward shore. His legs had gone numb. His fingers barely responded to his commands. But he kicked again, pulled with his one anchored arm, and felt his knee strike river rock beneath the surface. Shallow water. Close enough. He hauled them both onto the bank, his body shaking so violently he could barely stand. The baby lay motionless in his arms, her lips blue, her skin like ice. Ethan stripped off her soaked wrappings with clumsy fingers, tucked her inside his wool shirt against his bare chest, and ran. The cabin was 400 yards up the slope. It might as well have been 4 miles. His legs felt like wood, unresponsive and heavy. Ice formed in his beard, his hair, along his soaked trousers. The cold penetrated so deep he couldn't feel his feet anymore. Couldn't tell if he was still running or falling. But he made it. His shoulder hit the cabin door hard enough to bruise, and he stumbled inside where the morning fire still burned low in the stone hearth. Ethan fell to his knees in front of the fireplace, building up the flames with shaking hands, adding split wood until heat rolled out in waves. The baby still wasn't moving. He rubbed her small back, her arms, her legs, trying to force circulation, warmth, life back into that tiny body. "Come on," he said through chattering teeth. "Come on, little one. Breathe." Her chest hitched, once, twice. Then she coughed, water spilling from her mouth, and her eyes opened, gray as winter sky, wide and terrified. She started crying again, the most beautiful sound Ethan had ever heard. He wrapped her in dry blankets from his bed, held her close to the fire, and let her cry. His own body shook with cold and delayed shock, but he didn't move, didn't set her down. He just held her and fed the fire and waited for them both to stop shaking. It took an hour before the trembling subsided. The baby, he needed to call her something other than the baby, had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his chest, her small hand fisted in his shirt. Ethan looked down at her face, peaceful now in the firelight, and tried to make sense of what had happened. Someone had left her to die. The thought made something dark and angry coil in his chest. She hadn't ended up in that creek by accident. The nearest trail was 1/2 mile from where he'd found her, and babies didn't wander. Someone had carried her out into the wilderness in the dead of winter and left her to freeze or drown or both. Who would do that, and why? Ethan gently laid her on the pile of blankets near the hearth and set about changing his own wet clothes, his mind working through possibilities. An unwanted child, maybe. Happened sometimes in settlements where resources were tight and mouths to feed already too many. But why bring her all the way out here? Why not leave her at a church or a neighbor's door? Unless they wanted to make sure she was never found. He pulled on dry wool trousers and a flannel shirt, his skin still prickling with residual cold. The baby, he decided to call her Clara after his grandmother, who'd been the only kind presence in his childhood, stirred in her sleep, made a small sound that wasn't quite distress but wasn't peaceful either. Ethan studied her in the firelight. Now that she wasn't blue with cold, he could see she was healthy beneath the hypothermia. Round cheeks, solid limbs, no signs of neglect or abuse. Her dark hair curled slightly where it had dried. Maybe 10 months old, perhaps a year. Old enough to say one word. Mama. Had she been calling for her mother, or had someone taught her to say it? The question bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He needed supplies. Clara needed milk, soft food, clean cloth for diapers. His cabin was stocked for one man living rough through winter, not for caring for an infant. The nearest place to get what he needed was Miller's Crossing, the small settlement 12 miles south. But the storm that had been threatening all day was moving in now. He could hear wind beginning to howl around the cabin's corners, could see fresh snow starting to fall past the window. They were trapped here together, at least until morning. Maybe longer if the storm settled in hard. Ethan moved to his larder, taking stock. He had canned milk from the fall's supplies, though it wasn't ideal for a baby. Oats he could cook down into something soft. Plenty of flour, salt, dried beans. Not perfect, but they'd manage. He warmed milk carefully over the fire, testing it against his wrist the way he'd seen women do, then tried to get Clara to drink. She fussed at first, turning her head away, but hunger won out, and she latched onto the cup's edge, swallowing in small, desperate gulps. "Easy," Ethan said softly. "Easy now. Not too fast." She drank until the cup was empty, milk dribbling down her chin, then looked up at him with those serious gray eyes. Studying him, deciding something about this strange man in this strange place. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. He'd rescued cattle from floods, pulled horses from bogs, helped birth calves in the middle of snowstorms. But this was different. This small person trusted him completely in this moment because she had no other choice, and that trust felt like the heaviest thing he'd ever carried. "You're safe now," he told her, wiping the milk from her face with a clean cloth. "I don't know what happened to you, Clara, or why someone put you in that creek. But you're safe here. I promise you that." She reached up and grabbed his finger with her whole hand, holding tight. The storm hit in earnest as night fell. Wind screamed down from the peaks, driving snow horizontal past the windows, piling drifts against the cabin's north wall. Ethan kept the fire high and the shutters closed, creating a small, warm island in the frozen wilderness. Clara fussed through the evening, still traumatized from the cold and the terror of the creek. He walked with her, bouncing gently, humming tunes he half remembered from his own childhood. When she finally fell asleep, he fashioned a small bed for her from a wooden crate lined with his softest blankets, placing it near the hearth where she'd stay warm. He should have slept. He was exhausted, his body still recovering from the brutal cold of the creek, but Ethan found himself sitting up, his rifle across his knees, watching the door. Someone had tried to kill this child. That someone might come back to finish the job. The thought should have seemed paranoid. Out here, miles from anywhere, in the middle of a blizzard, nobody could reach the cabin tonight. But Ethan had learned the hard way that evil didn't always follow logical patterns. Sometimes it was relentless. Sometimes it came back. So he sat vigil through the night, feeding the fire, checking on Clara's breathing, listening to the storm rage outside and waiting for dawn. The blizzard blew itself out by morning, leaving the world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Ethan woke. He dozed off in his chair sometime near dawn, to pale sunlight streaming through the gaps in the shutters and Clara's hungry cries. He fed her more warmed milk and soft oats, pleased when she ate eagerly and kept it all down. Her color was good, her eyes alert. Whatever trauma she'd suffered, the resilience of youth was already helping her recover. But Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. He opened the shutters and studied the landscape. Pristine snow covered everything, unmarked except for the tracks of a fox that had passed near the cabin in the night. No sign of anyone approaching. No indication that they were anything but completely alone. Yet he felt watched. Nerves, he told himself, moving to his supplies to take inventory. He had enough to keep them fed for a few weeks if he was careful, but Clara needed proper baby supplies, and he needed answers. The question was whether to risk leaving her alone while he rode to Miller's Crossing, or to bundle her up and take her with him. Neither option felt safe. Alone, she was vulnerable if anyone came to the cabin. But outside in the cold, so soon after her near drowning, could be deadly in its own way. Ethan was still wrestling with the decision when he heard it, hoofbeats. His hand went to his rifle instantly, moving to the window. A single rider approached through the snow, following the creek trail from the south. A man on a dark horse, moving with purpose. Ethan's jaw tightened. The storm had only ended a few hours ago. Nobody traveled after a blizzard unless they had urgent business, or unless they were looking for something. He checked his rifle, made sure Clara was secure in her makeshift crib, and positioned himself near the door where he could see out but maintain cover. The rider drew closer, and Ethan could make out more details. Tall man, heavy coat, hat pulled low. Something about the way he sat his horse, rigid, tense, set Ethan's instincts screaming. The rider stopped 50 feet from the cabin, his horse dancing sideways in the snow. He didn't dismount, just sat there, staring at the cabin like he could see through the walls. "Ethan Cole!" the man called out. His voice was rough, edged with something that might have been anger or desperation. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got something that belongs to me." Ethan's finger moved to the rifle's trigger. He didn't answer, just waited. "The baby," the man continued. I saw the tracks by the creek yesterday before the storm hit. Saw where you pulled her out. She's mine, Cole. You need to give her back." Clara stirred at the sound of the stranger's voice, made a small whimpering sound. Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle. "Come out and we can talk about this civil-like," the man said. "Or I can come in and take her. Your choice." Ethan opened the door 6 inches, keeping the rifle trained on the rider. In the bright snow-reflected sunlight, he could see the man's face now, late 30s, hard-lived, with eyes that held no warmth. "That baby nearly died in the creek," Ethan said, his voice level and cold. "If she's yours, you've got a strange way of caring for her." The man's jaw worked. "That's none of your concern. What happens with the girl is family business. She becomes my concern the second I pull her out of freezing water." Ethan raised the rifle slightly, making sure the man saw it clearly. "And she's not going anywhere until I'm satisfied she'll be safe." "You're making a mistake, Cole." "I've made plenty of those. This isn't one of them." They stared at each other across the snow, 2 men locked in a silent contest of wills. Clara's whimpering grew louder, building toward a full cry. The sound seemed to affect the stranger, his face twisted with something that might have been pain or rage or both. "She's cursed," the man said suddenly. "That baby brought nothing but death to our family. Her mother died birthing her. My brother died in a logging accident 2 weeks later. Everything she touches turns to ash and blood. I was doing the world a favor by drowning a baby." Ethan's voice dripped contempt. "That's not ridding the world of a curse. That's murder dressed up in superstition. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Ethan stepped fully into the doorway now, the rifle steady in his hands. "You're scared. Something bad happened, and you needed someone to blame. She's small, she's helpless, so you made her the scapegoat. But that ends here." The stranger's hand moved toward something in his coat. Ethan thumbed back the rifle's hammer, the click loud in the cold air. "Don't," he said quietly. The man froze. Behind Ethan, Clara's cries filled the cabin, the sound of an infant in distress. It seemed to drain something from the stranger. His shoulders sagged, his face collapsed inward. "You can't keep her," he said, but there was no force behind it now, just exhaustion. "She's blood. Family has rights." "Family has responsibilities," Ethan countered, "which you abandoned the moment you put her in that creek. Now you need to leave. And if I see you on my land again, we won't be having a conversation. We'll be having a funeral." The threat hung in the air between them. The stranger looked at the cabin, at Ethan, at the rifle. Whatever he saw in the cowboy's face convinced him. He yanked his horse's reins hard, turning the animal. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Ethan replied. "It is." He watched the man ride away, back down the creek trail, until he disappeared into the tree line. Only then did Ethan lower the rifle, his hand shaking slightly with adrenaline and anger. He stepped back inside and closed the door, barring it with the heavy oak beam. Clara was crying in earnest now, her small face red with distress. Ethan set the rifle aside and picked her up, holding her close. "It's all right," he murmured, rocking her gently. "He's gone. You're safe." But even as he said it, he knew the stranger's words carried weight. This isn't over. Men who did desperate things often came back to finish them. The fact that the stranger had tracked Clara here, through a blizzard, meant this wasn't simple abandonment. There was something driving him, something beyond superstition and fear. Ethan carried Clara to the window, watching the empty trail. The storm might have passed, but another was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the prickling awareness that had kept him alive through 15 hard winters. Someone wanted this baby dead. And whoever that someone was, they weren't going to stop just because a lone cowboy said no. Clara's crying softened to hiccups against his shoulder. She was so small, so utterly dependent on him for everything: food, warmth, safety. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, it settled over his shoulders like familiar work, heavy but honest. "We're going to figure this out," he told her, carrying her back to the fire. "Whatever your story is, whoever hurt you, we're going to make sure you get a real chance at life. I promise you that." She looked up at him with those serious gray eyes, still too young to understand words, but perhaps sensing the commitment behind them. Her small hand reached up and touched his bearded face, exploratory and gentle. Ethan thought about the stranger's words. Cursed, brought nothing but death. Superstitious nonsense, the kind of poison that infected minds when people looked for easy answers to hard questions. But he'd seen what that kind of thinking did to people. How it could justify any cruelty, any violence, as long as you convinced yourself you were fighting some greater evil. Clara wasn't cursed. She was a baby who'd had the misfortune of being born into a family that confused grief with judgment, that needed someone to blame for their own bad luck. And they'd chosen her. Not anymore. Ethan spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin, checking sight lines, making sure he could defend their position if the stranger returned with reinforcements. It felt paranoid, excessive even, but he'd learned long ago that preparation bought survival, and right now survival was all that mattered. As darkness fell again, he fed Clara and settled her into her crate bed, watching as her eyes grew heavy and sleep claimed her. She looked peaceful now, content, like the trauma of the creek was already fading into instinct rather than memory. He hoped that was true. Hoped she was young enough that none of this would scar her, that she could grow up without the shadow of what had almost happened to her. But even as he hoped, Ethan prepared for the worst. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and positioned himself once more in the chair facing the door. Outside, the Montana winter pressed close around the cabin, vast and indifferent to the small drama unfolding within its frozen grasp. Somewhere in that darkness, a man rode with murder in his heart, convinced he was doing righteous work. And in the cabin's warm interior, a cowboy who'd chosen solitude over connection found himself willing to kill to protect a child he'd known for less than 2 days. Clara stirred in her sleep, made a small sound that wasn't quite distress. Ethan moved to her side immediately, placing a gentle hand on her small back until she settled again. "I've got you," he whispered into the darkness. "Whatever comes, I've got you." The fire crackled. The wind picked up outside, promising another cold night. And Ethan Cole, who'd spent 15 years avoiding responsibility for anyone but himself, sat vigil over a sleeping infant and waited for whatever dawn would bring. Dawn brought no peace, only confirmation that winter wasn't finished with them yet. Ethan woke to the sound of ice pelting against the shutters, a late-season storm that turned the world into a blur of white and gray. Clara was already awake, sitting up in her makeshift bed, watching him with those steady eyes that seemed too knowing for someone so small. "Morning, little one," he said, his voice rough with sleep. She reached for him immediately, and he picked her up, feeling the trust in that simple gesture like a weight against his chest. He fed her warmed milk and soft porridge while the storm raged outside, grateful for the reprieve it offered. Nobody would be traveling in this weather, not the stranger who'd come yesterday, not anyone. They had time, at least for now, to figure out their next move, but by mid-morning the storm had shifted into something else entirely. The wind changed direction, coming now from the east, and with it came a sound that made Ethan's blood run cold. Dogs. Baying in the distance, multiple voices carrying across the snow. He moved to the window, Clara balanced on his hip and scanned the tree line. Nothing yet. But those weren't wild dogs or wolves, they were hunting hounds, trained to track. And they were getting closer. "Damn," Ethan muttered, his mind racing through options. The stranger hadn't come alone this time. He'd brought help, and dogs meant they could track through conditions that would stop most men. Clara sensed his tension, her small hand fisting in his shirt. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. Panic got people killed. He needed to be smart about this. The cabin was defensible, but only against a small group. If the stranger had brought enough men, they could wait him out, starve them out, or simply set fire to the place. Ethan had supplies for a siege, but Clara needed more than he could provide long-term, and winter in the Montana Territory didn't forgive miscalculations. He set Clara in her bed and began preparing. Extra ammunition, water, food that could be eaten cold if they had to let the fire die. He filled his pockets with rifle cartridges, checked his revolver, and positioned both weapons within easy reach. The baying grew louder, closer. Ethan could distinguish individual dogs now, at least 3, maybe 4, and where there were dogs, there were men following. He just moved back to the window when he saw them emerge from the tree line. 5 riders this time, the stranger from yesterday in the lead, flanked by 4 others, The dogs ranged ahead of them, noses to the ground, pulling their handlers toward the cabin with single-minded purpose. The group stopped at the same place the stranger had yesterday, just beyond rifle range. Smart. They'd learned from the previous encounter. The stranger dismounted this time, standing in his stirrups to call out, "Cole, we need to talk." Ethan didn't answer. He watched the other men, cataloging details. Two of them looked like ranch hands, working men in worn coats and practical gear. The other two were different, harder, meaner, with the look of men who hired out their guns. The stranger had brought professionals. "I've got legal right to that child," the stranger shouted. "I'm her uncle, her blood kin, and I've got witnesses here to testify to it. You're holding her against family wishes. That's kidnapping in any territory." Clara whimpered at the raised voices. Ethan moved to her, picked her up, kept her close while he watched the men outside. "Kidnapping," one of the hired guns said, loud enough to carry. "That's a hanging offense, ain't it?" The threat was clear. They weren't just here to take Clara. They were here to make sure Ethan couldn't tell anyone what had really happened. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd been in tight spots before, had faced down claim jumpers, survived range wars, and weathered conflicts that most men wouldn't have walked away from. But this was different. This wasn't about land or cattle or pride. This was about a child who couldn't defend herself, whose entire future depended on what happened in the next few hours. "You've got 1 minute to bring her out," the stranger called. "After that, we come in and take her. And you." Ethan looked down at Clara. She was watching him, those gray eyes serious and calm despite the shouting outside. She trusted him, had no choice but to trust him, and he'd promised her safety. He made his decision. "You want her," Ethan called back, his voice carrying across the snow. "You're going to have to come through me to get her, and I promise you, some of you won't make it back down that mountain." The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with the knowledge that he meant every word. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, exchanging glances. They were being paid to intimidate, maybe to shoot if it came to that. But dying in the Montana wilderness for someone else's family feud? That was a different calculation. "You're one man," the stranger said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "You can't hold out forever?" "Don't need forever, just need to make it expensive enough that you decide she's not worth it." One of the ranch hands spoke up then, his voice carrying doubt. "Tom, maybe we should think about this. If he's willing to die for her, maybe—" "Shut up," the stranger, Tom, snapped. "She's cursed. You all know what happened after she was born. My sister dead, my brother dead, the ranch plagued with accidents and bad luck. It doesn't stop until she's gone. Or maybe it doesn't stop because you keep blaming an innocent baby for things that ain't her fault," Ethan called back. "People die, Tom. Accidents happen. That's life in this territory. But turning that into an excuse to murder a child? That's on you, not her." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. He saw it in the way the ranch hand shifted, and how one of the hired guns suddenly found something fascinating about his saddle horn to look at. Doubt was spreading through the group like ice across still water. Tom saw it too. $20 to each of you when this is done," he said quickly. $40 if we have to go in after her." Money talked. Ethan watched the hired guns straighten, their doubts bought and paid for. The ranch hands still looked uncertain, but they were here, and walking away now would mean losing wages in the dead of winter. "Last chance, Cole," Tom called. "Bring her out, or we're coming in." Ethan didn't answer. He moved away from the window, positioning himself where he had clear shots at the door and the main window. He set Clara in her bed, as far from the potential lines of fire as the small cabin allowed. "I'm sorry, little one," he said softly. "This is going to get loud, but I need you to stay right here. Understand? Stay down and stay quiet." She looked at him, solemn and trusting, and something in Ethan's chest cracked. He'd known this child for 2 days, 48 hours. But somewhere in the space between pulling her from that frozen creek and this moment, she'd become his to protect. Not because of blood or law or any claim recognized by the territory, just because she was small and helpless, and he'd been there when she needed someone. Sometimes that was enough. The first shot came without warning, punching through the shutter and embedding itself in the far wall. Clara cried out, and Ethan was moving before the echo faded, returning fire through the window. His bullet took one of the hired guns in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. Get around back, Tom was shouting. Circle the cabin. More shots followed, a sustained volley that tore through shutters and chipped at the log walls. Ethan stayed low, moving between positions, returning fire methodically. He wasn't trying to kill, not yet, just trying to make them understand that taking this cabin would cost them. He caught movement at the side window, swung the rifle that direction, and fired. The glass shattered, and someone outside cursed. One of the ranch hands, clutching a bleeding arm, stumbled back into view. "I'm hit!" the man yelled. "Tom, I'm hit!" "Then get to cover and stay there." Tom's voice had lost its certainty now, taking on the sharp edge of a man whose plan was falling apart. Ethan reloaded, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Clara was still crying, terrified by the noise and chaos. He wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but he couldn't. Not while men with guns surrounded his cabin. A log near the door exploded inward as someone fired a heavier caliber weapon, probably a buffalo gun or something similar. Splinters rained across the floor, and Ethan realized they were trying to weaken the door's structure. "They're going to rush it," he said aloud, his mind working through the tactical problem. The door was solid oak, but enough heavy rounds would compromise it, and once it gave way, 5 men could pour through faster than he could shoot them all. He needed to change their thinking. Ethan moved to his supplies, found the can of lamp oil he used for winter lighting, and poured it along the base of the door. Then he moved to the fireplace, pulled out a burning branch, and held it ready. "You want to come through this door," he shouted. "You're going to do it through fire." The shooting stopped. He could hear urgent conversation outside, too low to make out words, but the tone was clear. They hadn't expected this level of resistance, hadn't counted on him being willing to burn his own home to keep them out. "You're insane, Cole," Tom yelled. "I'm motivated," Ethan corrected. "There's a difference." Clara's cries had subsided to frightened whimpers. Ethan risked a glance at her. She'd curled into a tight ball in her bed, her small body shaking. The sight made something fierce and protective rise in him, sharp as any blade. "Tom," one of the ranch hands called out, "this ain't worth it. We got 2 men hit, and he's ready to burn the place down. The baby probably won't even survive the fire. What's the point?" "The point is she's cursed," Tom's voice cracked with desperation. "Don't you understand? As long as she lives, the bad luck continues. I've lost everything because of her. Everything." "You've lost everything because you're standing outside a cabin in a blizzard trying to murder your own niece," Ethan shouted back. "That's not curse-breaking, Tom. That's just evil dressed up in excuses." The words hung in the cold air. Ethan could see part of the group through the shattered window, the wounded hired gun being tended by one of the ranch hands, the other gun looking toward Tom with something like disgust on his face. "I'm done," the unwounded hired gun said suddenly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Whatever you're paying ain't worth this. Man in there is right. This is murder, and I don't kill babies for any price." He turned his horse, started riding away. Tom lunged for the man's reins, but the gun shoved him back hard enough to send him sprawling in the snow. "Anyone else want to stay and die for a madman's vendetta?" the gun called out. "Because that's what this is, and I've seen how it ends." One of the ranch hands helped his wounded friend into a saddle. "I'm getting him to a doctor," he said to Tom. "This whole thing's wrong, and you know it." "Cowards," Tom spat. "All of you cowards!" But they were leaving, the ranch hands and the wounded gun, picking their way back down the trail. That left Tom, alone now, standing in the snow with his dogs and his rage, and the certain knowledge that his plan had failed. Ethan watched him through the damaged window, rifle ready. Tom was the most dangerous now, cornered, desperate, with nothing left to lose. Men in that state did unpredictable things. "It's over, Tom," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Your men are gone. You're alone. And that baby in here is staying with me until I'm satisfied she'll be safe. You need to accept that and ride away." Tom's hands clenched into fists. For a long moment, Ethan thought he might charge the cabin anyway, might throw himself at the door in one final desperate attempt. The dogs sensed their master's tension, whining and pulling at their leads. Then Tom's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him all at once, leaving behind only exhaustion and grief. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "She took everything from me. My sister, my brother, the ranch. Everything I loved, gone. And she's still here, still breathing, while they're all dead. For the first time, Ethan heard past the rage to the pain underneath. Tom wasn't a monster. He was a man drowning in loss, lashing out at the only target he could reach. It didn't excuse what he tried to do, but it explained it. "I do understand," Ethan said, gentler now. "I know what it's like to lose people, to want someone to blame because the alternative is accepting that sometimes bad things just happen. But Tom, she's a baby. She didn't cause those deaths any more than you did, and killing her won't bring anyone back. It'll just add one more death to carry." Tom looked up at the cabin, his face twisted with anguish. "What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live with all this?" "You grieve," Ethan said simply. "You let yourself feel the loss, and then you choose to keep living anyway, because that's what the people who loved you would want. Not this, not revenge against an innocent child." The silence stretched between them, broken only by wind and the restless movement of the dogs. Clara had gone quiet in her bed, listening to voices she couldn't understand, waiting for the danger to pass. Finally, Tom gathered his reins. "If anything happens to her," he said, "if she dies or gets hurt, that's on you now. You took that responsibility when you pulled her from the creek." "I know," Ethan said, "and I'll carry it." Tom nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head, then mounted his horse. He sat there a moment longer, staring at the cabin, at the shattered window and damaged walls, at the physical evidence of how far he'd been willing to go. "I hope you're right," he said quietly. "I hope she's not cursed, because if she is, and you keep her close, she'll take everything from you too." Then he turned his horse and rode away, the dogs trotting alongside, leaving Ethan alone with the wreckage of the confrontation and a crying baby who'd survived another attempt on her life. Ethan lowered his rifle, his hands starting to shake now that the danger had passed. The cabin was a mess. Shattered windows, bullet holes, splinters everywhere. The cold was already seeping in through the damaged shutters, stealing the warmth his fire had built. He went to Clara first before anything else, picked her up, held her close, felt her small body shaking against his chest. "It's over," he murmured into her dark hair. "You're safe. I've got you." She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shirt, her face buried against his shoulder. She was too young to understand what had just happened, but she knew fear, knew danger, knew the difference between safety and threat. And right now, Ethan was the only safety she had. He carried her to the fireplace, building up the flames with one hand while holding her with the other. The immediate crisis was over, but winter wasn't forgiving. He needed to repair the shutters, patch the bullet holes, make the cabin weatherproof again before nightfall. Otherwise, they'd freeze. But first, Clara needed him, needed the comfort of being held, needed the reassurance that the world wasn't just violence and fear. So Ethan sat with her, rocking gently, humming those half-remembered tunes, while outside the wind picked up and fresh snow began to fall, covering the tracks in blood and evidence that anything had happened here at all. It took 2 hours to get Clara calm enough to sleep. She fought it, afraid that closing her eyes would bring back the terror. But exhaustion eventually won, and she drifted off in his arms, her small hand still fisted in his shirt even in sleep. Ethan laid her in her bed, covered her with blankets, then set about repairing the damage. He worked methodically, nailing boards over the shattered windows, stuffing cloth into bullet holes to stop the wind. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold until he could do proper repairs. As he worked, his mind turned over Tom's final words. "If she's cursed, she'll take everything from you too." Superstition and grief-talking, nothing more. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Tom had been trying to warn him, in his own broken way, trying to share the weight of the burden he'd been carrying. Ethan looked at Clara, sleeping peacefully despite everything. She was so small, so utterly innocent. Whatever deaths had followed her birth, she bore no responsibility for them. She was just a child who had had the misfortune of being born into tragedy. But Tom's warning raised a valid question. What was Ethan going to do with her long term? He couldn't keep her hidden in a cabin forever. She needed more than he could provide. Proper food, clothes, eventually education. She needed a life, not just survival. The nearest town with resources for a child was Helena, nearly 50 miles west. There were probably families there who'd take her in, raise her properly. The territorial orphanage, if nothing else. She'd have a chance at a normal life, away from Tom's vendetta and superstitious fear, but the thought of handing her over to strangers made Ethan's chest tight. She trusted him. In her small, simple way, she'd decided he was safe. And after everything she'd been through, breaking that trust felt like another kind of abandonment. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he asked the sleeping child. "I'm not a father. I don't know the first thing about raising a baby, but I can't just give you away either." Clara slept on, oblivious to his turmoil. Outside, the storm intensified, and Ethan finished his repairs by firelight, sealing them both into this small, warm space against the hostile world beyond. That night, as wind howled and snow piled against the walls, Ethan sat watch again. Not because he expected Tom to return. The man was broken, done, but because vigilance had become a habit, a way of honoring the promise he'd made to keep Clara safe. She woke twice in the night, crying out in her sleep. Each time, Ethan was there immediately, picking her up, walking with her until the fear passed and sleep reclaimed her. He wondered how long the nightmares would last, how many times she'd wake in terror before her young mind processed and released the trauma. He hoped it wouldn't scar her permanently, hoped she was young enough that these terrible days would fade into nothing more than vague unease, easily soothed by gentle hands and soft words. Near dawn, as the storm finally began to ease, Ethan stood at the patched window with Clara asleep on his shoulder, watching the sky lighten from black to gray. The worst was over. Tom was gone. His hired guns scattered, his vendetta exposed for the madness it was. They'd survived. But survival was just the beginning. Now came the harder question: what next? Could he really keep her, raise her, give her the life she deserved? Or was he being selfish, holding on to her because she filled some empty space in his own lonely existence? Ethan didn't have answers, just questions and doubts, and a sleeping baby who trusted him completely. One day at a time, he told himself, the same words that had gotten him through 15 hard winters. We'll figure it out one day at a time. Clara stirred, made a small sound against his shoulder, then settled back into sleep. Her weight was warm and real against his chest, proof that some things were worth fighting for, worth changing your whole life for. The sun broke through the clouds, sending pale light across the snow-covered landscape. It was still winter, still harsh and unforgiving, but spring would come eventually. It always did. And when it came, Ethan and Clara would face it together, whatever that meant, whatever it cost. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks passed before the next rider came, and this time it wasn't Tom. Ethan saw him from a distance, a single horseman moving slowly up the trail, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. No aggression in his approach, no attempt at concealment, just a steady, deliberate progress through snow that was finally starting to soften at the edges, hinting that winter might eventually release its grip. Clara was on the floor near the fire, playing with wooden spoons Ethan had carved for her, babbling to herself in that language only babies understood. She'd grown in the weeks since the confrontation, stronger, more confident, her gray eyes bright with curiosity about everything around her. The nightmares had faded to occasional whimpers in the night, easily soothed. Ethan watched the approaching rider while checking his rifle out of habit. The man was older, maybe 60, with a gray beard and the kind of weathered face that came from decades in the mountains. He wore a marshal's badge on his coat, visible even from a distance. Law had finally arrived. "Stay here, Clara," Ethan said, though she couldn't understand. He stepped outside, rifle held loose but ready, and waited as the marshal drew close enough to speak. "Ethan Cole?" the man called out, his voice rough but not hostile. "That's right." The marshal reined in his horse 20 feet from the cabin, his hands visible and empty. "Name's Walter Briggs. I'm the territorial marshal out of Helena. Mind if I step down? My back's not what it used to be, and I've been riding for 2 days. Ethan studied him, looking for deception or threat. Found nothing but tired honesty and the particular weariness of a man who'd seen too much and believed in too little. "Step down," Ethan said, "but keep your hands where I can see them." Briggs dismounted with a grunt, stretching his back and wincing. "Getting too old for this work," he muttered. He looked at the cabin, at the boarded windows and patched bullet holes. "Heard there was some trouble up here. Figured I should ride out and get the story firsthand before deciding what to do about it." "Who told you?" Man named Tom Hutchins came into Helena 3 weeks back, drunk, and talking about how you'd stolen his niece. Said you'd shot at him and his men when they came to claim her legal-like. Briggs pulled off his gloves, blowing on his hands. Of course, the men who rode with him told a different story when I tracked them down. Said Tom tried to hire them to murder a baby, and you stopped him. So I'm here to sort out which version is closer to truth. Claire's voice drifted from inside the cabin, singing tunelessly to herself. Briggs's eyebrows rose. That the baby in question? Ethan nodded slowly. Her name's Clara. I pulled her out of Blacktail Creek back in December. Someone had left her there to die. And you think that someone was Tom Hutchins? I know it was. He admitted as much when he came here demanding I give her back. Briggs was quiet for a moment, his weathered face unreadable. Tom says the baby's cursed, says she killed his sister and brother, brought bad luck to his whole family, says you're harboring something dangerous. Tom's grief made him crazy, Ethan said flatly. The baby didn't kill anyone. His sister died in childbirth, happens all the time in this territory. His brother died in a logging accident. Tragic, but not supernatural. Tom just needed someone to blame, and Clara was convenient. So you appointed yourself her protector. I pulled her out of a frozen creek. That made me responsible. Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the rifle. Are you here to take her? Briggs met his eyes, and something passed between them. An understanding between men who'd both seen the worst the territory had to offer and had to make hard choices about what mattered. That depends, the marshal said carefully, on whether you're planning to keep her or hand her over to the territorial authorities. What would the authorities do with her? Orphanage in Helena. It's not a bad place, far as those things go. Clean, warm, enough food. She'd be raised proper, maybe get adopted by a family with means. Briggs paused. Of course, she'd also be just another orphan, in a system that's got more children than resources. Might grow up there. Might not. Hard to say. Ethan looked back at the cabin, where Clara continued her one-sided conversation with the wooden spoons. In 3 weeks, she'd become part of the rhythm of his life. Wake at dawn to her babbling. Feed her. Play with her. Teach her to clap her hands and stack small stones. Watch her discover snow and firelight and the way dust motes danced in sunshine. Simple things that had transformed his solitary existence into something else entirely. What if I kept her? He asked. Briggs studied him with those tired, knowing eyes. Then you'd be raising a child alone in the wilderness. No woman to help, no family to support you. It'd be hard, Cole. Harder than anything you've done before. I know. You got any experience with children? None. Any idea what you're getting into? The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the responsibility that never ends? Ethan thought about the past 3 weeks. The exhaustion, the fear every time Clara coughed or seemed too warm. The weight of knowing that every decision he made affected another human being who couldn't speak for herself. Some, he said, enough to know it's not simple. Briggs nodded slowly. Tom Hutchins still has legal claim to that baby. He's her blood uncle, and territorial law gives family rights in these situations. He held up a hand before Ethan could speak. But Tom's also made it clear he believes she's cursed and dangerous. Put that in my report to the territorial judge. And I got statements from the men who rode with him, detailing how he tried to hire them for murder. That carries weight. So what happens now? Now I write my report, Briggs said, and I make a recommendation to the judge about what should be done. Could recommend the baby be placed in the orphanage. Could recommend she be given to Tom despite everything. Or, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Could recommend she be placed with someone who's already proven he'll protect her, even against impossible odds. Hope and fear warred in Ethan's chest. You'd recommend that? Depends on what I see here. Briggs gestured toward the cabin. Mind if I meet her? See how she's doing? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He led the marshal inside, where warmth and the smell of cooking oats greeted them. Clara looked up from her play, saw the stranger, and immediately crawled to Ethan, pulling herself up on his legs. Up, she said clearly. It was a new word, learned just 2 days ago, and Ethan still felt a small thrill every time she used it. He picked her up, and she immediately buried her face in his shoulder, peeking at Briggs from the safety of Ethan's arms. She's shy with strangers, Ethan explained. Briggs' expression softened. He'd probably seen 100 orphans in his time as marshal, children left behind by death or disaster. But something about Clara, her healthy color, her clean clothes, the way she clung to Ethan with absolute trust, seemed to affect him. "She looks well cared for," he said quietly. "Better than most babies I see in the territory." "I do my best." Briggs walked slowly around the cabin, taking in the repairs Ethan had made, the clean floor, the small bed fashioned from a crate, with careful attention to comfort. He saw the wooden spoons, the soft cloth toys Ethan had sewn from scraps. Evidence of a man trying to provide not just survival, but something approaching normalcy. "You love her," Briggs said. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked down at Clara, who'd relaxed now, and was studying the marshal with cautious interest. "She's mine to protect. That's enough." "No," Briggs said. "It's more than that, and we both know it. You could have turned her over to Tom, could have rode to Helena and handed her to the authorities. Would have been easier, safer. But you didn't. You kept her and fought for her, and now you're standing here ready to fight me if that's what it takes." Clara reached up and patted Ethan's bearded face, a gesture of affection she'd started doing recently. He caught her hand gently, kissed her small fingers without thinking about it. Briggs saw the exchange, nodded to himself like something had been confirmed. "I'm going to ask you straight, Cole. You want to keep this baby? Raise her as your own?" The question hung in the warm air of the cabin. Ethan had been avoiding thinking about it directly, taking things one day at a time like he'd promised himself. But now, forced to voice it, he realized the answer had been growing in him for weeks. "Yes," he said. "I want to keep her. Even knowing it'll change everything about your life? Even knowing people will talk, will question whether a single man should be raising a baby girl?" "Let them talk." Briggs smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Good answer." He moved to the door, looked out at the mountains still wrapped in winter. "I'll file my report when I get back to Helena. It'll take a few weeks for the judge to review it and make a decision. Until then, you keep doing what you're doing. Keep her safe, keep her healthy, keep being the father she needs." "And if the judge decides against me?" The marshal's expression hardened. "Then you'll have a choice to make, but cross that bridge when you come to it." He pulled his gloves back on, preparing to leave. "One more thing. Tom Hutchins is still in Helena. He's broken, drinking heavy, telling anyone who'll listen about the curse. Most folks dismiss him as a grief-mad fool, but some believe. And believers can be dangerous. He won't come back here." "Probably not, but keep your guard up anyway." Briggs mounted his horse with another pained grunt. "I'll send word when the judge makes his ruling. Could be a month, could be 3. Territorial justice moves slow. We'll be here." Briggs gathered his reins, then paused. "You know, I've been doing this work for near 30 years, seen every kind of ugly the territory can produce. But I've also seen moments of grace. People choosing to do right when doing wrong would be easier. That baby there, she's lucky. Most children in her situation don't get a second chance." "I'm the lucky one," Ethan said, and meant it. The marshal rode away, leading his pack mule back down the mountain. Ethan stood in the doorway with Clara in his arms, watching until Briggs disappeared into the trees. The encounter had settled something in him, made real what had been forming in his heart. Clara was his, not by blood or law yet, but by choice and commitment, and the kind of bond that formed when you'd fight the world to keep someone safe. "What do you think, little one?" he asked her. "Think you can put up with me for the long haul?" She grabbed his beard and pulled, laughing when he pretended it hurt. The sound filled the cabin with light and warmth, driving back shadows he hadn't even known were there. The weeks that followed took on a different quality. Before, Ethan had been surviving, protecting, waiting for the next threat. Now he was building something, a life, not just an existence. He started making plans. Come spring, he'd ride to Helena and buy proper supplies, baby clothes, better food, maybe some toys. He'd need to expand the cabin eventually, add a proper room for Clara as she grew, and he'd need to think about the future, about how to provide for her beyond simple survival. But those were good problems, the kind that came from hope rather than fear. The thaw came gradually, sneaking up on them in degrees. First, the snow stopped falling with such frequency. Then the ice along the creek edges began to melt during the day, refreezing at night. The sound of running water grew louder, more insistent, as winter's grip weakened. Clara grew too, changing almost daily. She pulled herself up on furniture, took wobbling steps while holding Ethan's hands, developed opinions about what she wanted to eat and when she wanted to sleep. Her vocabulary expanded, mama, up, no, and Ethan's favorite, in, her attempt at his name. He taught her about the world around them in small doses, showed her how to be gentle with the horses, how to recognize animal tracks in the snow, how to stack firewood. She was too young to understand most of it, but Ethan talked to her anyway, explaining everything he did, making her part of his daily rhythm. And every night, before she slept, he told her the same thing. "You're safe here, Clara. I've got you, and I'm not letting go." She'd smile, already drowsy, and reach for his hand. And Ethan would sit beside her makeshift bed until sleep claimed her, marveling at how completely this small person had rearranged his entire understanding of what mattered. It was during one of these quiet evenings, with Clara already asleep and Ethan working on a new toy by firelight, that he heard the horses. Multiple riders again, approaching fast. His hand went to his rifle instantly, and he moved to the window, cursing himself for getting comfortable, for letting his guard down. But these weren't Tom's men. The lead rider wore a marshal's badge. Briggs returned far sooner than expected, and behind him rode two others, a man and a woman Ethan didn't recognize. Something was wrong. Briggs wouldn't have brought strangers unless there was news, and news that required witnesses or authority. Ethan stepped outside, rifle in hand, but lowered. "Marshal, didn't expect you back so soon." Briggs dismounted heavily, his face grim. "Wish I wasn't. Got something you need to hear, and it couldn't wait." He gestured to the couple behind him. "This is Samuel and Margaret Hutchins, Tom's brother and sister-in-law." Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. Another branch of Clara's blood family, come to make their claim. He should have known it wouldn't be simple. Samuel Hutchins was younger than Tom, maybe 40, with the same hard features but kinder eyes. His wife Margaret looked worn down by frontier life but had warmth in her face that her husband's family seemed to lack. "Mr. Cole," Samuel said, his voice careful, "we came as soon as we heard what Tom tried to do. We've been living in Oregon Territory, didn't know about our sister's death, or the baby, until word reached us last month." "What do you want?" Ethan asked bluntly. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped together. "We want to see our niece. We want to know she's all right. And," she glanced at her husband, drew strength from him, "we want to make things right." "Right how?" "Tom's gone," Briggs said quietly. "Drunk himself to death 2 weeks ago, fell through ice on Lake Helena, and by the time anyone found him, it was too late." The news should have brought relief. Instead, Ethan felt only sadness for a man so consumed by grief that he destroyed himself rather than heal. "The judge got my report same day we got word of Tom's death," Briggs continued. "He was preparing to rule on Clara's custody when Samuel and Margaret showed up, claiming family rights." Ethan's stomach dropped. "You're here to take her." "No," Margaret said quickly. "No, that's not why we came." She looked at her husband again, and he nodded encouragement. "We have 3 children of our own back in Oregon. Good kids, healthy, happy. But we heard what happened to Clara, what Tom tried to do, and we couldn't just let it go. She's family. So you want custody." "We want her to be safe," Samuel said. "We want her to be loved and cared for by someone who will put her first. And from what the marshal tells us, that's exactly what you've been doing." Ethan tried to follow the logic, to understand where this was leading. "I don't understand." Margaret smiled, gentle and genuine. "Mr. Cole, we're not here to take Clara from you. We're here to help you keep her." Briggs stepped forward. The judge needed proof that Clara wouldn't be taken by blood family who might share Tom's delusions. "Samuel and Margaret are willing to sign legal documents relinquishing any claim to Clara and supporting your petition to adopt her. With their statement and my report, the judge is prepared to grant you legal guardianship." The words took a moment to penetrate. Legal guardianship. Not just protecting her or hiding her, but actually becoming her father in the eyes of the law. "Why?" Ethan asked, looking at Samuel and Margaret. "You don't know me. For all you know, I'm no better than Tom." "We know enough," Samuel said. "We know you pulled her from that creek. We know you fought off armed men to protect her. We know you've kept her alive and healthy through one of the worst winters this territory's seen. He met Ethan's eyes. That tells us everything we need to know about your character. Margaret moved closer, her expression earnest. Our sister died bringing Clara into this world. That's tragedy, but it's not curse. It's just the hard reality of frontier life. And our brother Tom, he let his grief twist into something poisonous. But you, Mr. Cole, you turned tragedy into love. You gave Clara a second chance at life. That's what our sister would have wanted. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked back at the cabin, where Clara slept peacefully, unaware that her entire future was being decided in this moment. I don't have much, he said. Just this cabin and some horses. I can't give her the life a family like yours could provide. She doesn't need much, Margaret said softly. She just needs someone who'll love her unconditionally, someone who'll fight for her when she can't fight for herself. You've already proven you're that person. Samuel pulled papers from his coat. The marshal brought the legal documents. All we need is your agreement to adopt Clara as your daughter, and we'll sign as witnesses and relinquish any competing claims. And then? Ethan asked Briggs. Then I take these papers back to Helena, the judge signs the adoption decree, and Clara becomes legally yours. Briggs smiled. Congratulations, Cole. You're about to become a father. The weight of it crashed over him. Not burden, but responsibility laced with something that felt dangerously close to joy. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself that solitude was safer than connection. But Clara had shattered that isolation, had forced him to care again, to hope again, to believe that some things were worth the risk of loss. I'll do it, Ethan said. I'll adopt her. Margaret's face lit up with genuine happiness. Samuel extended his hand and Ethan shook it, feeling the warmth of acceptance and support from people who had every right to judge him but chose grace instead. They went inside together, and Margaret gasped softly when she saw Clara sleeping peacefully in her bed, so obviously loved and cared for. She knelt beside the makeshift crib, tears streaming down her face. She looks like our sister, Margaret whispered. Same nose, same chin, but those eyes, those are from her father. Her father? Ethan asked. Samuel's face darkened. A drifter who left town the day after our sister told him she was pregnant. We never saw him again. That's why she was living with Tom. She had nowhere else to go. So Clara's father had abandoned her before she was even born. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and her uncle had tried to kill her out of superstitious madness. She'd been unwanted by everyone except the stranger who'd pulled her from a frozen creek. She's wanted now, Ethan said firmly. By me. For as long as she needs me. Forever then, Margaret said, reaching up to squeeze his hand. Because children always need their fathers. They signed the papers by lamplight, witnessed and sealed. Samuel and Margaret stayed for a simple dinner, sharing stories about Clara's mother, painting a picture of a kind woman who'd made one mistake but deserved better than the fate she'd received. Tell Clara about her mother, Margaret urged as they prepared to leave. Don't let her grow up thinking she came from nothing. Our sister Catherine, she was brave and strong, and she loved this baby, even knowing it might cost her life. I will, Ethan promised. She'll know where she came from. After they left, riding back to Helena with Briggs and the precious legal documents, Ethan sat alone in the quiet cabin. Clara still slept, unaware that her life had just changed forever, that she was no longer an orphan dependent on a stranger's charity, but a daughter with a father who'd chosen her deliberately. He picked up one of the wooden spoons he'd carved for her, feeling the smooth grain under his thumb. Such a simple thing, but made with care and attention. That's what he could give her, not wealth or status or an easy life, but care and attention, and the fierce protection of someone who'd already proven he'd die before he'd let her come to harm. You're mine now, he said softly to the sleeping child. Really mine. And I'm yours. Guess we're stuck with each other, Clara Cole. The name sounded right. Clara Cole, daughter of Ethan Cole. A family made not by blood, but by choice and circumstance, and the kind of love that grew from shared hardship. Outside, the sound of running water grew louder as more ice melted. Winter was ending at last, giving way to the promise of spring. And with it came the possibility of new beginnings, fresh starts, and the hope that even in the hardest territory, life could find a way to flourish. Spring arrived not with fanfare but with persistence, wearing down winter's defenses one warm day at a time. The creek that had nearly claimed Clara's life now ran clear and gentle. The roar of dangerous current softened to a steady murmur. Patches of brown earth appeared through melting snow, and the first brave shoots of green pushed through the cold ground, reaching for sunlight. Clara took her first independent steps on one of those early spring mornings, letting go of the chair she'd been using for support and walking 3 wobbling paces into Ethan's waiting arms. He caught her, lifted her high, and her delighted laughter rang through the cabin like bells. "Look at you," he said, spinning her around. "Walking all on your own. Won't be long before I can't keep up with you." She grabbed his face with both hands, planted a wet kiss on his cheek, and said, "Papa, clear as day." Ethan froze. She'd been trying the word for weeks, approximating it in various forms, but this was the first time she'd said it properly. Papa, not E-N or any other baby version, but the real word, chosen and delivered with intention. "That's right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your papa, and you're my Clara." The legal documents had arrived from Helena 2 weeks prior, official and stamped with the territorial seal. Clara Cole, daughter of Ethan Cole, adopted in the eyes of the law and recognized by the Montana Territory as his legitimate child. Briggs had delivered them personally, along with news that Tom had been buried quietly and that Samuel and Margaret sent their best wishes for Clara's future. Ethan had read those papers a dozen times, still half expecting them to vanish like a dream. But they were real, solid as the ground beneath his feet. Clara was his daughter now, protected not just by his determination, but by the full weight of territorial law. He'd started making changes immediately. The cabin received proper repairs. New glass for the windows, fresh chinking between the logs, a second room added for Clara as she grew. He'd traded furs and labor for lumber, worked late into the evenings building walls and installing a door, creating a space that would be hers alone. The work was hard but satisfying in a way his previous solitary existence had never been. Everything he built now had purpose beyond mere survival. The expanded cabin wasn't just shelter, it was a home. The garden plot he prepared wasn't just for food, it was for teaching Clara where vegetables came from. The gentle mare he'd traded for wasn't just transportation. She was for the day Clara would learn to ride. Every decision carried her future in it, and Ethan found himself planning years ahead instead of just seasons. What would she need when she was 5, 10, 15? How would he teach her to read when he'd only had basic schooling himself? What would he tell her when she asked about her mother, about why she didn't have family beyond him? These questions worried at him during quiet moments, but they were good worries, the kind that came from caring about outcomes, from investing in something beyond your own immediate needs. One afternoon in late March, Ethan was working on the garden plot while Clara played nearby, digging in the soft dirt with a wooden spoon. She was content in the way only children could be, finding infinite entertainment in simple things. He just turned over a section of earth when he heard a horse approaching. His hand went to the rifle propped against the fence post, old habits dying hard. But the rider who emerged from the tree line was familiar, Marshall Briggs, looking even more tired than the last time Ethan had seen him. "Marshall," Ethan called out, relaxing slightly. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Briggs dismounted with his usual pained grunt. "Wish I was here for a social call, but I've got news you need to hear." He spotted Clara, and his weathered face softened. "She's grown. Like a weed, walking now, getting into everything." Ethan lifted Clara, brushing dirt from her dress. "What's the news?" The marshal's expression turned serious. "There's been talk in Helena about you, about Clara, about the circumstances of her adoption. Most of it's harmless gossip, but some of it's turning ugly." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" "Folks questioning whether a single man should be raising a baby girl, wondering if maybe the territorial authorities made a mistake. There's a woman in particular, Agnes Pemberton, who's made it her mission to rescue Clara from what she calls an inappropriate situation." "Who is she?" "Runs the orphanage in Helena. Decent woman in most respects, but she's got firm ideas about propriety and family structure. She's petitioning the territorial judge to review the adoption, claims it's not in Clara's best interest to be raised by an unmarried man in the wilderness." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through, after the legal documents and the acceptance and the promise of a fresh start, someone was trying to take Clara away based on nothing more than social convention. Can she do that? He asked. Can she challenge the adoption? Briggs shrugged. Judge has discretion to review cases if there's concern for the child's welfare. Usually that discretion is used for actual abuse or neglect, but Agnes has influential friends. She's gotten his ear, and he's agreed to at least hear her petition. When? 2 weeks. There'll be a hearing in Helena. You'll need to be there to defend your custody. Briggs met his eyes. I'll testify on your behalf. Tell the judge what I saw here. But you should know, appearances matter in these situations. Agnes will paint you as a rough bachelor unsuited for raising a proper young lady. You'll need to counter that somehow. Clara squirmed in Ethan's arms, wanting down to return to her dirt pile. He set her on the ground, watched her toddle back to her play, and felt rage and fear war in his chest. She's mine, he said flatly. The law says she's mine. Some busybody in Helena doesn't get to change that because she doesn't approve of how I live. I agree with you, Briggs said. But the law also says judges can act in the best interest of children, even against existing custody arrangements. You need to take this seriously, Cole. Agnes is. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to think past the anger. What do I need to do? Show up to the hearing. Bring Clara so the judge can see she's healthy and well cared for. Maybe bring some character witnesses, people who can speak to your fitness as a father. Briggs paused. And it wouldn't hurt to clean yourself up some. Show the judge you're respectable, not just some mountain hermit. The suggestion rankled, but Ethan recognized the wisdom in it. He was being judged not just on his actions, but on perceptions, on whether he fit Helena society's narrow definition of what a parent should look like. I'll be there, he said. Whatever it takes to keep her, I'll do it. Briggs nodded, satisfied. Good. The hearing's set for April 10th at 10 in the morning. Don't be late. After the marshal left, Ethan sat on the ground next to Clara, watching her play. She'd moved on from digging to carefully placing small stones in a line, her tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when she was focused. Looks like we've got another fight ahead of us, he told her. But we've won before. We'll win again. She looked up at him, smiled, and offered him a dirt-covered stone. He took it solemnly, added it to her careful arrangement, and received another brilliant smile in return. That smile was worth fighting for. Worth traveling to Helena and facing down judges and busybodies and anyone else who thought they knew better than him what Clara needed. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan rode to Miller's Crossing and bought new clothes for himself and Clara, practical but respectable, the kind that wouldn't give anyone ammunition to use against him. He practiced what he'd say to the judge, rehearsing words that felt awkward and formal in his mouth. He also wrote to Samuel and Margaret Hutchins, explaining the situation and asking if they'd be willing to travel to Helena to testify. Their support had been crucial in the initial adoption. Maybe it would be enough to sway the judge again. On April 8th, Ethan loaded supplies onto his horse, settled Clara into a carrier he'd fashioned that would keep her secure during the ride, and started the long journey to Helena. The spring weather was unpredictable. Warm sunshine 1 hour, cold rain the next. But they made steady progress, stopping frequently to let Clara stretch and play. She loved the journey, pointing at birds and deer and rushing water, babbling commentary on everything she saw. Her delight in discovery reminded Ethan of why he was doing this, what he stood to lose if Agnes Pemberton had her way. They reached Helena on the evening of April 9th, the territorial capital bustling with activity. Ethan found a boarding house that would take them both, ignoring the proprietor's raised eyebrows at a man traveling alone with a baby. He paid for 2 nights, got Clara fed and settled, and tried to sleep despite the worry churning in his gut. The hearing was held in the territorial courthouse, a solid brick building that spoke of permanence and authority. Ethan arrived early, Clara in his arms, and found Marshal Briggs waiting outside. Samuel and Margaret couldn't make it, Briggs said without preamble. Got word yesterday that their youngest came down with scarlet fever. They're stuck in Oregon until the child recovers. Ethan's heart sank. Losing that testimony hurt. But he nodded, adjusted Clara on his hip, and said, Then we'll just have to make do with what we have. Agnes Pemberton arrived 20 minutes later. a tall woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and the kind of righteousness that came from absolute certainty in one's own moral superiority. She was accompanied by two other women, clearly supporters, and a lawyer in an expensive suit. She spotted Ethan and Clara, and her mouth thinned into a disapproving line. "Mr. Cole, I presume," she said, her voice crisp and cold. "I want you to know this isn't personal. I simply believe that child deserves better than to be raised in isolation by someone ill-equipped to provide proper feminine guidance. She deserves to be loved and protected," Ethan said evenly, "which is exactly what I provide. Love is not enough. She needs education, refinement, exposure to proper society. She needs a mother's influence as she grows. Surely you can see that a man alone cannot provide these things." Clara, sensing the tension, buried her face in Ethan's shoulder. He held her closer, protective. "What I see is a woman who doesn't know the first thing about my daughter trying to take her from the only parent she's ever known. That's not concern, Mrs. Pemberton. That's arrogance." Agnes's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the courthouse doors opened and a clerk called them inside. The courtroom was smaller than Ethan expected, with wooden benches and a raised platform where Judge Harrison presided. He was in his 60s, stern-faced, with the kind of gravity that came from years of making decisions that affected people's lives. "This is a review hearing concerning the adoption of Clara Cole," the judge began without preamble. "Mrs. Pemberton has petitioned for review on the grounds that the current custody arrangement is not in the child's best interest. Mr. Cole, you're here to defend your custody. Both parties will have opportunity to present their case." Agnes's lawyer stood first, a smooth-talking man who painted Ethan as a well-meaning but ultimately unsuitable guardian. He emphasized Ethan's isolation, his lack of female companionship, his rough frontier lifestyle. He called it admirable that Ethan had rescued Clara, but questioned whether rescue obligated permanent custody. "The child needs stability, Your Honor. She needs education and proper socialization. She needs to learn the skills and graces appropriate to young ladies. Mr. Cole, despite his good intentions, cannot provide these things. Mrs. Pemberton's orphanage can. We have teachers, proper dormitories, and most importantly, a path toward eventual adoption by a suitable married couple who can give this child the complete family structure she deserves." When it was Ethan's turn, he stood awkwardly, Clara still in his arms. He wasn't used to public speaking, to defending himself in formal settings, but he knew his truth, and he spoke it plainly. "Your Honor, I pulled Clara from a frozen creek last December. Her uncle had tried to kill her because he thought she was cursed. I kept her alive through the worst winter in recent memory. I fought off armed men to protect her, and when I had the chance to hand her over to the territorial authorities, I chose instead to become her father." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Pemberton says Clara needs things I can't provide. Maybe she's right about some of them. I'm not educated. I don't know about refinement or society graces. But I know about protection and love and commitment. I know about showing up every day and putting someone else's needs before your own. I know about building a life around another person because they matter more than your own comfort." Clara stirred against his shoulder, looked up at him with those serious gray eyes, and said clearly, "Papa." The word carried in the quiet courtroom. Judge Harrison's expression shifted slightly, something softening around his eyes. "She calls you Papa," he observed. "Yes, sir. Has for about a month now." "And how does she seem to you? Happy? Healthy?" "Both, Your Honor. She's walking now, talking more every day. She plays and laughs and gets into everything the way babies should. She's not afraid of me or uncomfortable around me. She's just a child being raised by someone who loves her." Agnes stood then, her voice sharp. "Sentiment is not the same as suitability, Your Honor. Yes. Mr. Cole clearly cares for the child, but care without proper structure and guidance will fail her as she grows. What happens when she's 10 and needs schooling, 15 and needs guidance about becoming a young woman? A bachelor cannot provide these things." "I'll figure it out," Ethan said firmly. "Same as any parent figures things out. I'll hire teachers if needed. I'll talk to women I trust about questions I can't answer myself. I'll adapt and learn and do whatever it takes because that's what parents do." "That's what married parents with resources do," Agnes corrected. "You're asking this child to grow up isolated and unschooled simply because you've grown attached to her. That's selfish, Mr. Cole, not loving. The accusation stung because it touched on his own deepest fears. Was he being selfish? Was he keeping Clara because she needed him, or because he needed her? Marshal Briggs stood then, his voice cutting through Ethan's doubts. Your Honor, if I may, I've known Ethan Cole for several months now, since this situation first came to my attention. I've been to his cabin, seen how he cares for Clara, watched how she responds to him. That child is loved, safe, and thriving. Mrs. Pemberton speaks about what Clara needs, but she's never met her. She doesn't know that Clara's uncle tried to murder her, or that the adoptive father she's dismissing saved the child's life multiple times. The past is irrelevant, Agnes's lawyer interjected. We're concerned with the child's future. The past is entirely relevant, Briggs shot back, because it shows character, it shows commitment. Mr. Cole didn't have to take responsibility for Clara. He could have brought her to Helena, handed her over, and gone back to his solitary life. But he didn't. He chose her, fought for her, became her legal father. That kind of devotion doesn't stop just because a child gets older or situations get more complicated. Judge Harrison listened to all of it, his expression unreadable. When both sides had finished their arguments, he sat back in his chair and studied Clara, who'd grown bored with the proceedings and was playing with the buttons on Ethan's shirt. Mrs. Pemberton, the judge said finally, your concerns about Mr. Cole's suitability are noted. However, I see no evidence of abuse, neglect, or incapability. The child appears healthy and well-adjusted. The legal adoption was properly executed with appropriate family consent. And most importantly, the child has clearly bonded with her adoptive father. Agnes opened her mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand. However, I am also mindful that children's needs change as they grow. Mr. Cole, I'm going to maintain your custody of Clara, but with conditions. You will ensure she receives proper education, either by hiring tutors or enrolling her in school when she's of age. You will make your home accessible to periodic welfare checks by territorial authorities to ensure her continued well-being. And should circumstances change that make you unable to care for her properly, you will contact the territorial office immediately. Relief flooded through Ethan so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. Yes, Your Honor, all of that, yes. Mrs. Pemberton, your petition is denied. This adoption stands. Agnes's face went rigid with anger and disappointment. Your Honor, I must protest. Your protest is noted and overruled. This hearing is concluded. The judge's gavel came down with finality. Ethan held Clara tighter, almost unable to believe it was over. She was still his. They'd won. Briggs clapped him on the shoulder. Congratulations, Cole. Now, get that girl home before Agnes finds another angle to attack from. But Agnes approached them as they were leaving, her face still tight with disapproval. You think you've won, Mr. Cole. But mark my words, that child will suffer from your inadequacy. When she's older and realizes what she's missed, what she could have had, she'll resent you for it. Ethan met her eyes steadily. Maybe. Or maybe she'll appreciate that I fought to keep her when others wanted to ship her off to an institution. Either way, it'll be her choice to make when she's grown. Not yours, not mine. Hers. He walked past her into the spring sunshine, Clara laughing as the light hit her face. The battle was over. Clara was legally, permanently his. No one could challenge that now without evidence of actual harm. They stayed one more night in Helena, and Ethan used the time to buy supplies he'd need for Clara's future. Slates and chalk for when she was ready to learn letters, cloth for making proper dresses, books he couldn't read himself, but that someone could teach her from someday. The ride home took 2 days, but Ethan didn't mind. Clara was happy in her carrier, pointing at everything, practicing her small vocabulary, secure in the knowledge that her papa was there. When they finally reached the cabin, the spring garden had started to sprout, green shoots pushing through dark earth. The creek ran clear and gentle, bearing no resemblance to the deadly torrent it had been in December. The mountains stood eternal and beautiful, promising both challenge and shelter in equal measure. Ethan carried Clara inside, set her down in her room, her own space that he'd built with his hands, and watched her immediately go to her toys, settling into familiar comfort. We're home, he said softly. Really home now. No more fighting, no more running, just us, building a life together. Clara looked up at him and smiled, holding out a wooden horse he'd carved for her. He sat on the floor beside her, took the toy, and began to play, making hoarse sounds that sent her into peals of laughter. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal. Inside, a father and daughter played together, their bond forged in crisis but sustained by something simpler and more powerful. Love. Choice. Commitment. The foundation of every real family, regardless of how it begins. Summer arrived in full glory, transforming the Montana Territory into a landscape so different from winter's harsh beauty that it seemed impossible they occupied the same space. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in waves of purple and yellow. The creek ran cool and inviting over smooth stones, and the air carried the scent of pine and wild sage. The cabin that had once been a fortress against the cold now stood with windows thrown open, welcoming warm breezes that carried Clara's laughter out across the valley. She was walking confidently now, running even, chasing butterflies through the tall grass with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who'd never learned to doubt her own safety. Ethan watched from where he worked in the garden, pulling weeds and checking the progress of carrots and potatoes that would see them through the next winter. He kept one eye always on Clara, a habit so ingrained he barely noticed it anymore. "Papa, look!" she called, holding up a dandelion gone to seed. She blew on it with all her might, sending white fluff spiraling into the blue sky, and laughed with pure delight at the magic of it. "Beautiful," Ethan called back, smiling at her joy. "Bring me another one." She scampered off in search of more dandelions, her dark hair curling in the humidity, her small bare feet sure on the uneven ground. She'd grown so much in the 6 months since he'd pulled her from the creek. Not just physically, though she'd done that too, but in confidence and personality. She had opinions now, preferences, a stubborn streak that reminded Ethan of himself. The garden had become their shared project. Clara helped in her own way, carrying small stones to mark rows, patting down soil around seedlings with serious concentration, watering plants with a cup that spilled more water on her than the vegetables. She was learning, absorbing knowledge about the world through experience rather than instruction. Ethan straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and saw a rider approaching from the south trail. His first instinct was still wariness, hand moving toward the rifle that leaned against the fence. But recognition came quickly. Marshal Briggs, making one of his periodic welfare checks as the judge had ordered. "Marshal?" Ethan called in greeting. "Didn't expect you for another few weeks." Briggs dismounted with slightly less difficulty than usual, the warm weather apparently easing his old bones. "Figured I'd combine official business with personal curiosity. Heard some interesting things in Helena, wanted to see for myself if they were true." Clara had spotted the visitor and come running, but she hung back shyly when she reached Ethan, grabbing his leg and peering at Briggs from safety. "Miss Clara," Briggs said formally, tipping his hat to her. "My, you've gotten big, walking and everything." She giggled, hiding her face against Ethan's pants. "What things did you hear?" Ethan asked, curious but cautious. Briggs smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Heard you've been making regular trips to Miller's Crossing, buying books, hiring a tutor to come out once a week. Folks are saying Ethan Cole's getting civilized." "Just keeping my promises to the judge," Ethan said, but there was no defensiveness in it. "Clara needs education. I'm making sure she gets it. And I heard something else, too. Something about a certain widow from the settlement who's been visiting your cabin, helping with Clara, teaching her things a father can't." Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "Sarah Miller is a friend. She's been kind enough to help with Clara's care, teaching her about cooking and sewing and such. Nothing more to it than that." Briggs' knowing smile said he didn't quite believe that, but he let it pass. "Well, friend or not, it's good for Clara to have a woman's influence. Shows you're serious about providing what she needs." The truth was more complicated than Briggs knew. Sarah Miller was indeed a widow, her husband having died in a mining accident 2 years prior. She'd been running the general store in Miller's Crossing when Ethan had come through buying supplies last month, and she'd taken immediate interest in Clara, asking questions about her care and offering gentle suggestions. The suggestions had turned into an offer to visit the cabin, to help with things Ethan struggled with. Clara's hair, for instance, Ethan could keep it clean but had no idea how to braid it or pin it properly, and clothes, which Sarah could sew better than any store-bought alternatives. She'd come out twice now, spending afternoons teaching Clara songs and games while showing Ethan how to manage the practical details of raising a daughter. There was something else growing between them too, something unspoken but present in the way Sarah smiled at him, the way her hand lingered when passing Clara over, the way she looked at the cabin and garden like she was imagining herself as part of it. Ethan felt the pull of it, the loneliness he'd carried for so long responding to her warmth and competence. But he was cautious. Clara had to come first. Any relationship he pursued had to be right for her, not just for him. The official report will say Clara's thriving, Briggs said, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. Healthy, happy, well cared for, receiving appropriate education and socialization. Agnes Pemberton won't have any ammunition for another challenge. She's still trying? She grumbles, but the judge made his position clear. Unless there's evidence of actual harm, your custody stands. Briggs paused. Though I'll be honest, Cole, having a woman around would silence her complaints permanently. Not saying you should marry for convenience, but it wouldn't hurt your position. Ethan looked at Clara, who'd grown brave enough to approach Briggs' horse, reaching up to touch its soft nose with careful fingers. If I marry, it'll be because it's right for Clara and for me, not to satisfy Helena society. Fair enough? Briggs mounted his horse with a satisfied grunt. You're doing good work here, Cole. That girl's lucky to have you. After the marshal left, Ethan returned to the garden with Clara, letting her help by picking tiny green tomatoes that weren't nearly ready for harvest. He didn't stop her, just redirected her to pulling weeds instead, praising her efforts even when she occasionally pulled vegetables along with the unwanted plants. They were working companionably when another rider appeared, this one expected and welcomed. Sarah Miller arrived on her gentle mare, a basket strapped behind her saddle and a wide smile on her face. Sarah! Clara abandoned the garden immediately, running to greet her with outstretched arms. Sarah dismounted and scooped Clara up, spinning her around. There's my sweet girl. Have you been helping your papa? Helped, Clara declared proudly. Pulled weeds. I can see that. Look at your dirty hands. We'll have to get you cleaned up before we make those cookies I promised. Ethan approached, removing his work gloves. You didn't have to bring supplies. I could have provided what you needed. I wanted to, Sarah said simply. She met his eyes and something passed between them, warm and promising. Besides, I had some extra strawberries from my garden. Thought Clara might enjoy them. They spent the afternoon together, the three of them, falling into an easy rhythm that felt almost like family. Sarah taught Clara to help make simple sugar cookies while Ethan finished the garden work and started dinner. The cabin filled with the scent of baking and cooking, with Clara's chatter and Sarah's patient responses, with a domestic peace Ethan hadn't known he'd been missing. Over dinner, Clara between them in her high chair, Sarah said carefully, I've been thinking about your situation, Ethan, about Clara's education and socialization. The tutor's working well, Ethan said. She's learning her letters, and he says she's bright. She is bright, but she needs more than just book learning. Sarah paused, choosing her words. She needs playmates, other children, and she needs to see how families work, how men and women interact, how communities function. Ethan set down his fork. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to think about joining the community more fully. Maybe moving closer to Miller's Crossing, where Clara could attend school with other children, where you wouldn't be so isolated. The suggestion hit harder than expected. This cabin was where Ethan had built his life, where he'd saved Clara, where they'd fought their battles and won. Leaving it felt like abandoning something essential. But Sarah continued, her voice gentle. I know this place means a lot to you, but Clara's growing. Soon she'll need more than what you can provide alone out here, no matter how dedicated you are. She'll need friends and teachers and exposure to life beyond these mountains. I can't just leave, Ethan said. This is our home. It could still be your home for hunting season, for summers, but winters in town where Clara's not isolated, where she has opportunities. Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Ethan. I'm trying to help you see what's best for her. Clara, oblivious to the adult tension, smeared cookie crumbs across her face and declared, All done. Sarah laughed, breaking the moment, and went to clean Clara up. But her words stayed with Ethan through the rest of the evening, through helping put Clara to bed, through walking Sarah to her horse as sunset painted the sky orange and gold. "Think about it," Sarah said as she prepared to ride home. "You don't have to decide anything now. Just consider what Clara will need as she grows, what opportunities you want her to have." She leaned up and kissed his cheek, a brief touch that carried promise and affection in equal measure. Then she mounted her horse and rode away, leaving Ethan standing in the gathering darkness with more questions than answers. That night, after Clara was asleep, Ethan sat outside and looked at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. He'd come to this territory 15 years ago specifically for the isolation, for the escape from expectations and connections that could fail you. He'd built a life of deliberate solitude, convinced it was safer than risking attachment. Then a baby girl had been thrown into a frozen creek, and everything he'd believed about safety and isolation had been proven wrong. Clara had taught him that connection wasn't weakness, that caring about someone else's future was worth any risk. But Sarah's words forced him to confront a harder truth, that loving Clara meant wanting more for her than he could provide alone. The summer continued its warm progression, and Ethan found himself watching Clara with new eyes. She was endlessly curious about everything, asking questions he couldn't always answer, wanting to explore beyond the boundaries of their small world. When the tutor came, she absorbed knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain, her quick mind already working through concepts that amazed both Ethan and the teacher. Sarah visited more frequently, and her presence became essential rather than just helpful. Clara adored her, ran to her immediately whenever she arrived, chattered about everything she'd learned and discovered since the last visit. And Sarah responded with genuine affection, treating Clara not as a burden or charity case, but as a child worth investing in. One evening in late July, after Clara was asleep, Sarah and Ethan sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the meadow. "I have a proposal," Sarah said quietly, "and I want you to hear me out before you respond." Ethan's pulse quickened, uncertainty mixing with anticipation. "I'm listening." "The store in Miller's Crossing is doing well enough that I could afford help. I could spend more time here with Clara, teaching her things she needs to know. I could even move out here if you'd be willing to expand the cabin to give me my own space." She took a breath, gathering courage. "Or you could marry me, and we could make this official. I know it's practical more than romantic, and I know we haven't courted properly, but I care about Clara like she's already mine. And I care about you, Ethan Cole, more than I probably should after such a short time. We could be a family, a real one, for Clara's sake and for ours." The words hung in the night air, honest and vulnerable. Ethan looked at this woman who'd come into their lives and made everything better, who'd seen Clara's needs clearly and offered to help meet them without hesitation. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I won't lie and say I haven't thought about it. You've been good for us, better than I knew we needed. But marriage is permanent, and I need to know you understand what you'd be taking on. Clara will always come first for me. Always. If that's something you can live with—" "Ethan," Sarah interrupted gently, "Clara coming first is exactly why I want this. I'm not looking to replace anyone or compete for your attention. I'm looking to be part of something good, to help raise a child who deserves every advantage we can give her. And yes, I'm also looking for companionship, for partnership, for someone to share the burdens and joys of life with. But those things aren't separate from Clara. They're all connected." She reached for his hand in the darkness. "I'm not asking you to love me the way you might have loved someone in a traditional courtship. I'm asking you to build something with me, to let me be part of Clara's life and yours in a permanent way. The rest, affection, partnership, maybe even love, that can grow as we work together. But the foundation is her, and that's exactly how it should be." Ethan thought about the winter ahead, about the challenges that would come as Clara grew older and needed more than he could provide alone. He thought about Sarah's patience and warmth, her competence and kindness. He thought about how Clara's face lit up when Sarah arrived, how naturally they'd fallen into routines that felt like family. "I need to think about it," he said finally, "not because I doubt you, but because this decision affects all of us. I need to be sure it's right." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." But as summer deepened and August arrived with its golden heat, Ethan found his answer not in thinking but in observing. He watched Sarah teach Clara to braid daisy chains, her her patient hands guiding small fingers. He watched Clara run to Sarah with scraped knees and hurt feelings, seeking comfort she knew would be freely given. He watched Sarah look at the cabin and land with eyes that saw not just property, but home. And he watched himself, noticed how his shoulders relaxed when Sarah was there, how conversations flowed easier, how the burden of single parenthood lifted when shared with someone who genuinely cared. On a warm evening in mid-August, with Clara playing in the creek under their watchful eyes, Ethan said, "Yes." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want you to be part of this family, officially. Yes to all of it." He met her eyes. "You're right that it's practical, but it's more than that too. You've made our lives better, Sarah. Clara loves you, and I—" He paused, finding words for feelings he'd suppressed for so long. "I care about you more than I expected to, more than I probably should after such a short time. But there it is." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, happy ones that she didn't try to hide. "Then we should do it properly. A real wedding in Miller's Crossing, with witnesses and celebration. Clara should see us make this commitment publicly, should understand that we're choosing to be a family." The wedding happened 3 weeks later, on a clear September morning when summer was just beginning to think about turning toward fall. Most of Miller's Crossing turned out for it, curious about the mountain hermit who'd rescued a baby and was now marrying their widowed shopkeeper. Marshall Briggs stood as Ethan's witness, traveling from Helena specifically for the occasion. Samuel and Margaret Hutchins even made the journey from Oregon, wanting to see Clara settled and happy. Clara wore a white dress Sarah had sewn, with flowers in her dark hair, and she stood between Ethan and Sarah during the brief ceremony, holding both their hands. When the minister pronounced them married, she clapped her hands and said, "Mama," pointing at Sarah, a title she'd been testing for weeks but now claimed with confidence. Sarah knelt down, tears streaming freely now, and gathered Clara into her arms. "Yes, sweet girl, I'm your mama now, and your papa and I are going to take such good care of you." The celebration afterward was simple but joyful, food and music and dancing in the town square. Ethan, who'd avoided community gatherings for 15 years, found himself enjoying the connection, the belonging, the acceptance of people who'd decided his past didn't matter as much as his present choices. Margaret Hutchins sought him out as the sun began to set, Clara asleep on Sarah's shoulder nearby. "Our sister Catherine would be so happy," Margaret said softly. "To know her daughter is loved like this, has a real family who chose her deliberately. You've given Clara what Catherine wanted most, a chance at a good life." "She gave me what I needed too," Ethan said honestly. "Purpose, connection, a reason to be better than I was. That's what children do, if we let them." Margaret smiled. "Take care of each other. That's all any family can really do." They stayed in Miller's Crossing for a week after the wedding, Sarah introducing Clara to other children, letting her see what community looked like. Clara was hesitant at first, clinging to Ethan or Sarah, but curiosity eventually won out, and she began to play, to share, to discover the joy of friendship. Watching her laugh with other children, Ethan understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him. Clara needed this, not as a replacement for the cabin and mountains she loved, but as a complement to it. She needed both wilderness and community, both independence and connection. So they made a plan. They'd spend winters in Miller's Crossing, where Clara could attend school and be part of the community. Summers they'd return to the cabin, where she could run wild in the meadows and learn the skills of frontier life. The best of both worlds, adapted to her changing needs as she grew. The first snow fell in late October, marking the transition to their new life. The cabin stood empty but cared for, ready for summer's return. In Miller's Crossing, Ethan had purchased a small house near Sarah's store, with room for Clara and space for the family they were becoming. Clara adapted quickly, her resilience a testament to how secure she felt in Ethan and Sarah's love. She made friends at school, learned to read with astonishing speed, and brought home drawings and stories and questions that kept both her parents engaged and entertained. One evening in December, exactly 1 year after Ethan had pulled Clara from the frozen creek, the three of them sat before their fireplace in town. Clara was nestled between her parents, drowsy from a full day of play and learning. "Papa," she said sleepily, "tell story." "About creek." She asked for this story often, the tale of how Ethan had found her and saved her. Sarah had been worried at first that the story might traumatize Clara, but Ethan had understood what his daughter needed, to know her origins, to understand how she'd come to be part of this family. So he told it again, his voice soft in the firelit room. One winter day, when snow covered everything and the world was frozen, I heard a voice, small and scared, calling for Mama. I followed that voice to a creek, and there you were, the bravest baby I'd ever seen, fighting to stay alive in water that wanted to pull you under. You saved me, Clara murmured, a key part of the story she always needed confirmed. I did. I pulled you out and brought you home, and you've been mine ever since. And then Mama came, Clara added, reaching for Sarah's hand. Then Mama came, Sarah agreed, kissing Clara's forehead, and made our family complete. Clara sighed, content, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, secure in the knowledge of where she belonged. Ethan looked at Sarah over their daughter's head, saw his own gratitude and wonder reflected there. They'd built something real from tragedy and chance and choice. Not perfect. No family was perfect. But genuine and strong and rooted in love that had been tested and proven. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For seeing what we needed. For being brave enough to offer it. For loving her like she's yours. Sarah smiled. She is mine, just like she's yours. That's how family works. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle and steady, covering Miller's Crossing in white. The creek where Clara had nearly died ran distant and frozen, locked in winter's grip. But here, in this warm house with these people who'd chosen each other deliberately, life flourished. Clara Cole, once abandoned to die in frozen water, now slept safe between parents who would walk through fire to protect her. The journey from that desperate winter day to this peaceful evening had been hard, marked by conflict and fear and uncertainty. But every challenge had been worth it, every fight justified by the simple fact of this child's existence and the family that had formed around her. Spring would come again, as it always did. The creek would thaw and run gentle. They'd return to the cabin for summer adventures, teaching Clara about wilderness and independence and the vast beauty of the Montana Territory. But they'd also return here each winter, to community and school and the connections that made life rich. Clara would grow up knowing both worlds, understanding that strength came in many forms. The solitary courage of her father who'd saved her life, the quiet determination of her mother who'd chosen to love her, and her own resilient spirit that had survived impossible odds to claim the future she deserved. The fire crackled. Snow fell, and Ethan Cole, who'd spent 15 years convinced that isolation was safety, held his sleeping daughter and grateful wife, and understood that he'd been wrong. Safety wasn't isolation. It was this: people who chose to stay, who fought for each other, who built something permanent from the fragile materials of trust and commitment and love. It was family, however that family came to be. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.